Hello everybody and welcome to Chapter 5 Video 2A. Section 2 in Chapter 5, like Section 1, is kind of a long section. There's a lot of stuff that's in it, so rather than just try and cram it all into one long video, I'm going to break it up into two videos like I did with Section 1. So where we had Chapter 5 videos 1A and 1B, we're going to do the same thing with 2A and 2B. So in this one, we're going to be talking about how Rome moves from republic to empire. In the last video, we discussed a number of things about the Roman Republic, right? What it was, how its government was structured, what Roman society was like during that period, all that stuff. In this video, we're going to be talking about how Rome transitioned from a republic, something that literally means of the people, into an empire with an absolute monarchy. Before we get into talking about the actual change from a republic to an empire, though, we're going to talk about Roman conquest and expansion. The last thing we discussed in the previous video was how Rome, using a very effective and highly trained army, was increasing its power by conquering all of the Italian peninsula. Rome wasn't content with just Italy, though. Rome wanted to control the entire Mediterranean, which is going to lead it into conflict with other people. The most notable of these conflicts was the Punic Wars. Now, the Punic Wars were three wars fought against Carthage. All right, Carthage was a city-state, emphasis on the was, thanks to Rome, but they were a city-state in North Africa right there, okay? Here's Europe, and remember, this is Africa on the other side of the Mediterranean, right? So we remember this map from previous videos. There's the Italian peninsula, the big red boot, and then you got Africa across the Mediterranean. So Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians. We learned about the Phoenicians back in chapter 2. Let me erase this ink here. There we go. All right, the Phoenicians were from the Middle East. They were from this region in here, and they created trading outposts all along the Mediterranean, right? You see all of these areas in here. They didn't create a military empire. They created a trade empire. They dominated trade throughout the ancient world. The Roman word for Phoenician is Punicus, hence the name Punic that the wars were named for. So in any event, Carthage dominated the Mediterranean and controlled all trade. All right. Now, as Rome expanded westward, conflict between the two was inevitable. And from 264 to 146, Rome and Carthage fought a series of wars that would result in Rome taking Carthage's spot at the top of the Mediterranean. All right, so the first Punic War, I got a little ahead of myself by putting that up already, but now we're on this. The first Punic War was won by Rome. All three. Rome is going to be the winner, so we don't necessarily even need to write that down. Just remember it. Rome is 3-0. This is not a best-of-3 type of situation. And they gain control of several key islands. So after the first Punic War, Rome wins control of Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. All right, so these three islands right here are now all under Roman control. So that means that any ships that are coming in and out this entire part of the Mediterranean is now going to be controlled by Rome. So the Carthaginians, they wanted revenge for their defeat, and this is going to lead to... All right, so we got Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. And this is going to lead to the Second Punic War. In the Second Punic War, they actually came close to defeating Rome. It's best known for the Carthaginian general Hannibal. Now, Hannibal led a massive army through Spain, France, and invaded Italy. All right, you see the way that he went was actually started here down in the south of Spain. All right, here's Carthage. Here's Rome. There's Carthage. But Hannibal started down here. He spent years attacking Roman forces in Europe, but he was never at his full strength because of the route he took. Right? Hannibal knew that he couldn't attack Italy head on. Right? You can't just go right across the sea and do this because of what we just talked about in the First Punic War. Right? You know, Rome had taken control of all of these islands up here. So he decided to come in the other way. He decided to come across Spain and then follow this route and then come in through the north of Italy and try and attack Rome that way. In order to get there, though, you got to march your armies across several mountain ranges. You got the Pyrenees Mountains right here. You got the Alps Mountains through here. And this is going to be difficult for anybody, but it's very difficult when you're marching tens of thousands of troops and a bunch of war elephants as well. All right, so this invasion of Italy, it seemed like a good idea. It didn't totally fail, but it never worked out quite the way that Hannibal envisioned. Eventually, the Romans drew Hannibal out of Italy by attacking Carthage itself, forcing the general to return to defend his homeland, where he was finally defeated. All right, so we've got Rome 2, Carthage 0 so far. The Third Punic War, Carthage was utterly destroyed. The city was burned to the ground, and most of its inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery. So by the end of the Punic Wars, Rome is the undisputed power of the Mediterranean. Now, this type of expansion is known as imperialism. Imperialism is when a country expands its influence or control over other areas and people. It's basically going out and creating an empire of some kind. The Punic Wars were an example of imperialism. Rome wasn't defending its own territory or homeland. It was aggressively seeking to add territory, and you did not want to get in their way. But Rome wasn't just expanding into Carthage's territory. Right? You look by the 2nd century BC, so we're talking like the 100s BCE, Rome had conquered big chunks of those Hellenistic empires over here as well. Remember, they were the leftovers from Alexander the Great's conquest. The Mediterranean by this point had truly become what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, and this is Latin for our sea. Yeah, and they were fully justified in calling it that, since they had total control over all trade and most of the land that surrounded it. All right, so next, let's take a look at the impact of imperialism. Imperialism can bring tons of benefits to the conquering nation, and in Rome's case, it made Rome the wealthiest city of the Mediterranean. Rome controlled all the trade routes in the Mediterranean, and goods from all over the known world at that time were coming into Roman markets. This increase in trade led to an expansion of a wealthy merchant class. Right? They were now living the good life the way that the patricians typically did. And these wealthy families, they dressed in extravagant clothes, and they lived in these huge mansions on what were known as latifundias. Latifundias were large estates. These latifundias were akin to large plantations that used to be found in the southern United States before the Civil War. And like southern plantations, latifundias made extensive use of slave labor. Just move me out of the way. Slaves in Rome primarily came from conquered peoples. Roman law allowed someone to sell themselves into slavery in order to pay off a debt, but by far the most common form of slavery was from conquest and prisoners of war, like what happened to the people of Carthage. Slave labor in Rome was huge. In the century before Jesus was born, slaves made up about 30 to 40% of the population in Italy. Owning humans as property is obviously morally wrong, but it also brought economic problems. The reliance on slave labor really hurt small farmers. Small farmers couldn't produce food as cheap as large latifundias. Latifundias used slaves they didn't have to pay. So small farmers couldn't keep up with the big plantations, and many were forced to sell their land and move to Rome looking for work. So while Rome as a nation continued to expand and become wealthier, the foundations of the Republic eventually fell into decline. A huge problem that Rome was facing was conflict among the social classes. Now, this just wasn't a matter of poor people resenting rich people. Patricians and plebs were literally killing each other in the streets of Rome. This violence even spilled into politics when factions supporting the Senate would fight against factions supporting the tribunes. Tribunes were even assassinated. They would hire their own armies to do this fighting. It really got crazy. Other problems were slave uprisings. We just talked about how Italy had a huge slave population. A couple of times these large numbers of slaves organized full-scale rebellions that had to be put down by the military. And the military even now was a problem, because these citizen soldiers were becoming professional armies. Now, what I mean by this is that a citizen soldier serves in the military for a relatively short period of time, but always intends to return to his life as a private citizen. Professional soldiers make being a soldier their entire career. This means that their loyalty was not always for the glory of Rome. Their loyalty rather was to their commander, who was going to put food in their belly and promise them riches through conquest. This gave generals their own private armies. And if a general wanted to use his private army to take over, it was going to be a problem to stop him. No general was successful in fully gaining control, though, until this guy, Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was a very popular general. His armies were responsible for conquering the province of Gaul. All right, here's Gaul, which today is France. His popularity, though, made him a threat to the Senate. The Senate feared his popularity among the people and the fact that he had a large and very loyal army at his back. The Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome. Caesar returned to Rome, but he didn't come along. He marched to Rome with his army, and when he crossed the Rubicon River, all right, which is a river in northern Italy right here, anytime you go there, you are officially entering into the Roman heartland. And once he came with his army, he was officially branded a traitor to Rome by the Senate. So sides were now drawn and civil war broke out. Right, you had Caesar on one side and you had supporters of the Senate and the Republic on the other, one of which was an old friend of Caesar's but felt that Caesar needed to be stopped. Caesar was victorious and afterwards gave himself absolute power. He made himself a dictator. He became an almost godlike figure. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Once in power, Caesar set out to implementing several reforms that were designed to build his support among the plebs, but also strengthen Rome. You know, he did have good intentions with these. It wasn't just about consolidating power for himself. He created jobs through public works like building bridges and aqueducts and things like that. He gave publicly owned land, a land that was owned by the government. He distributed that to the poor. He even expanded citizenship for more people. So now people could participate politically in Rome. Now, Caesar's enemies feared he was going to make himself king. They thought that's the next step. He's already a dictator. Dictators, remember we learned about in a previous video, were expected to give up their power like Cincinnatus did. They knew Caesar wasn't going to do it, so they said the only logical step is he's going to make himself a king or an emperor, and they decided that drastic measures needed to be taken to stop him. This led to his assassination. In March of 44 BCE, the Senate, after fearing that he was going to become king, they waited until he showed up on the Senate floor itself, and the senators themselves stabbed him numerous times. They didn't hire assassins. They didn't do it in a back alley. They did it publicly on the Senate floor. They had hoped that with his death, the Republic would be saved and that the tyrant Caesar would be gone, but this would not stop the conflict, nor would it save the Republic in the long run. But we are going to stop here and get into all of that stuff in the next video.